You've entered Bookstorm. Your favorite authors are here to dive down deep into their best-selling books. Stay tuned to brave the storm.
All right. Well, welcome back to BOOKSTORM Podcast. Listeners, we have you all over the world. We've got you in 94 countries and territories, all 50 states. And that is because your favorite best-selling authors are here on this podcast. And today we have a very special treat. We've got JILL SHAVIS. She is coming back. I want to say third, but it might be the fourth time. We were trying to figure that out. We love her books, and we are just thrilled that she is here. Jill, welcome back again.
Thank you so much. I really appreciate you having me, and it's always a good time.
Always. Well, I want to tell our listeners just a little bit about you in case they hadn't listened to those other episodes, and I'm sure they'll go back and do that after this one. Now, you write contemporary romance and romantic comedies. There's all kinds of adventures and shenanigans, and I love this. Sexy times, but don't tell your mother. And you've sold 20 million plus copies worldwide to date, and you live in a small town near Lake Tahoe, a mountain town, and there's some quirky characters there that may or may not resemble some of your characters in your story. We're not going to ask you any questions about that. But you overall are a New York Times and a USA Today best-selling author. We love your stories. They are the stories we need right now, I feel like, as a nation and as people even outside of our nation, because they are filled with laughter and love. And I love this, a happily ever after.
Thank you. I actually consider them mac and cheese, comfort food.
That is
Well,
exactly what I was eating last night reviewing this.
Favorite.
well, even beyond mac and cheese, of course, you always have those underlying themes relating to relationships and dynamics. And so I want to give our listeners just a little bit of what's going on with the story. And if you want to add anything, of course, we love when you do that. But here we are, this story is set in Sunrise Cove, first of all. You have a lot of stories set there. They are independent, but these characters, we are friends with them. They come back again and again in different stories, but they all stand alone and you can read them in any order. So I want to make sure
You
that
have some series where you should read them in order. This is not one of them. The Sunrise Cove is connected by the setting of Lake Tahoe. And basically the characters come and go. There's no order. You can't do it wrong.
you can't do it wrong and you will always enjoy them. So now in this story, we've got a couple things going on. First of all, we meet Olive Porter. She left her small town to go to the big city overseas, and she's kind of gotten her act together. She's not the same person who left, but she does come back maybe with a few things she has not resolved from her childhood, from growing up, from relationships. She comes
Definitely.
back, right? And she realizes her parents, she hasn't heard from them in a little bit. They're kind of off the grid. They go camping. You might not hear from them for a bit, and that's not that unusual. She's a little uneasy. She
Well,
runs into
you talked about themes. I think the theme of this one is, can you go home again? I mean, there's several things.
yes.
That's one of them. She purposely left at a young age because her parents were off the grid and she wanted more out of life. She wanted internet. She wanted air conditioning, she wanted things. And I think it's been many years since she's been back. And so you also have the fish out of water story now.
Yes. Oh, that's such a great way of summing that up. That's great. So now she runs into an old flame, and let's talk about Noah for a second. He
Sure.
is an investigative agent with the National Park Service, and he's used to living under pressure. He has had, though, an incident that has laid him up, and it's a little
Yeah.
frustrating for him. He's a man of action, and he's getting doted on by his family. He's looking for a bit of a diversion, but in walks Olive, and that undoes him a little bit. There's no
Well,
way he wants to.
they
Go
never
ahead.
met, they never met to see each other again. They have a bit of a past that I'm not going to reveal as teenagers. And his thing was he also needed away from his very loving, very generous family. He needed some time away, and his job gave him that. So when he's injured and he can't take care of himself, he ends up back home and he's looking for a diversion at the same time that Olive comes back to town, needing someone to help her find her parents. So she is both his biggest nightmare and his way out.
Oh, I think that's a perfect setup. And if you want, we can leave it there because we're going to dive into these
Sure.
very juicy dynamics.
Let's go for it.
So I think that's a perfect segue because we were just talking about, themes and Olive's choice to leave home and, not having that fulfillment in Sunrise Grove at the start. And I think it was clear that that dichotomy of choice was a running theme from the very beginning. So specifically, these characters have to live with the results of their choices. And sometimes the result of those choices is not, and it doesn't meet their expectations, or it exceeds them, or it's a completely different result. Do you view regret of a choice as a burden that your characters must bear, or is that just a natural part of life that we all have to learn to navigate, like navigating around that maybe unexpected result?
I think life is messy and you can take your choices, your regrets, two ways. You can regret them and just always regret them and be a little bitter about it, or you can try to go back. And maybe there's a third way. You can try to learn from the regret and move on. And I think Olive has regrets about what she left behind. And I don't think she really has faced it or let herself realize that until she's back. And so as an adult now, she's has to deal with the regrets and the choices that teenage Olive made. I think it's fascinating to do that. In contemporary, I should say, it's so hard to come up with believable conflicts in a contemporary rom-com or a contemporary romance because I said this a million times, you don't have ghosts, you don't necessarily have the suspense. There is a little suspense in this one, but you don't have like apocalypse, you don't have a post-war, you don't have history. So you have to find conflict in the moment, and that can be really difficult. So by giving them a bit of a pass and a little bit of a mystery to solve, I was able to ante up on the conflict.
Absolutely. And just as a comment, I think you did a really fantastic job introducing conflict in the surrounding characters as well, because it gave Olive an extra edge and a different facet to her personality, I should say, when she has to be faced with things that are completely outside of her control.
And she doesn't like things that are out of her control. So that's what she has to learn how to deal with. She loves her best friend, Katie. They grew up together, but Katie is different. And therefore, and Olive was different. And so therefore they were a bit of, I called them the misfits. All their lives, the two of them have been misfits. And it's interesting to see them do that as adults.
Now, I want to ask you, Jill, because, again, your stories are very funny. You have a great sense of humor, and the characters just come out with those zingers and the one-liners. But you're always exploring these deeper, deeper themes. And I want to ask you about another one of them. Both Olive and Noah felt tremendous guilt over unintentional harm that they inflicted on others. And, they really struggled with that, even when people said, move forward, it's not your fault. In fact, at one point, Joe, who's Noah's friend, says to Noah, we both know how much you like to take the blame for everything. I don't know if it's because you always had to do that growing up or what. Do you think that we need to teach young adults that there's a difference between taking accountability for the intentional acts that we do versus the unintentional ones? Wouldn't that alleviate a lot of stress on people?
It would, but it's super hard to do. When you feel guilty, like you're sunk into that guilt, and it's not always easy to face it. And I honestly think Olive didn't face any of that until she came back. And for Noah, he did have unintentional implications of something that he did in the past that affected Olive for a long time forward, that also that affected Joe. And so he has these big regrets. And I think he's doing the best he can to right those wrongs. And I think it makes him a really great hero that he wants to right the ones that weren't his fault and that he didn't intend. And he's still trying to fix them. And I think we could all use a little bit of that.
Yeah. In fact, I remember, as a parent having to figure out the difference between intentional acts that a child would do and then just accidents. And you can't get mad about those accidents and discipline a child for that because they start to internalize all that blame for everything then.
Yes. And Noah had the other problem of where he grew up trying to compensate for what the trouble that Katie caused unintentionally. So he was always trying to be the good one, the don't make any waves one. And I think that left a lot of room for guilt. For anything that goes wrong, he takes it on. He was one of my favorite heroes because he was also like, he's kind of badass. He's really badass in his job. And he's sexy and funny and smart, and and yet he's deeply flawed. And so I didn't intend for him to have such a big story of his own, but he walked onto the page and just had this story with him.
I
I
love how you
believe it.
put that. And he was a relatable character, I think, for me too, as just an older kind of brother who very took on that sense of responsibility and accountability for his family. So reading that, I was like, oh, I completely understand why he had to leave and come back and kind of separate himself from some of that conflict going on, which is, I guess, a good intro into my next question. And it was about Olive, but honestly, Noah too. We meet both of them at this transitionary point in their lives. She has an established career, she has friends, she has, things going on across the pond, but she comes back home. And like we said about Noah, he had to leave, he has his job, but he also came back home. And while they were searching for, I don't want to give too much away about the plot, but while they were searching and they're out there, I feel like she and maybe him as well were searching for something within themselves, whether that was confidence or courage or even just closure of what had happened to them in the past. I couldn't get that out of my head that they were seeking something better for themselves. And
And
so
I
do you
love that
think
they
that
found
oh, sorry, go right ahead.
and I love that they found it. And I think you're right. It was seeking all of those things,
Absolutely.
especially closure between the two of them.
Absolutely. And do you think that that physical change in those journeys that they took, that 1,000 miles away from home, even just an hour away from home with a commute, is that necessary for our personal growth as people? Do we need to get away from home to come back to have kind of those realizations about where we came from?
I think if you're people like Noah and Olive who buried their issues deep and told themselves it didn't matter because they no longer had any sort of a relationship. So anything that had happened in the past between them, it was in the past. They honestly believe that until, you know, they go on this trip and it's just the two of them and they have nothing to do but give themselves closure. And I think they actually thought they were going to have closure. And of course, that's not actually what happens. They
Right.
don't get, they don't really get closure at all. They get something else, something better.
Right.
We've been talking about some of these things that we carry forward from our childhood, even these traumas that stay with us. But we also saw in your story that love and desire can also stay rooted. And I wanted to ask you about that first love. Is it something that's always hard to shake?
I think it depends on how first love ends. Everyone has had one, right? Whether you're still with that person, which is kind of unlikely in today's day and age, and you've moved on, you learn something every step of the way, every time you were in love. And these two, they were so young. I think that definitely stuck in their heart because it was not only the first time either of them felt something, now it's in the 10, all these years later, 10 years later, it's back. It never went away, probably, and they never faced it. So here they are facing it. And I think that if today you ran into your first love, you would have a little, not necessarily a pang, depending on how it ended, because they usually end badly, but you would feel something big because it was the first time you felt that.
Right.
Yeah, and we also see how it shapes everyone thereafter and how you approach relationships. And I think that's just such a fascinating part of this story. And again, also beautiful and fun and sexy, and you will laugh. This is the kind of book I'm telling you that we need right now.
Thank you.
I absolutely did laugh a number of times, and there was one that just stuck out to me. And I loved how you put Olive's thoughts in between her dialogue, right? And there was one comment that stuck out, and she said, um, "Oh, I think a child was talking about hermit crabs," and she was like, "Kind of icky," and then to the child, she was like, "That's great, that's so cool." And I was like, I feel like I'm in somebody's head because that's how we would think about things and how we would treat a child or other people, and just the way you wrote it really put us in that headspace.
Thank you. As we were talking about how hard it is to put conflict in a contemporary, and then you mentioned that sometimes the issues I come up with are deep. I do that because I don't think you can be funny unless you're facing real stuff. You need the deep stuff to, and then you need the comedy to offset it.
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Well, I want to tell our listeners how to get in touch with you because they need to read all of your books if they haven't already. And you have a beautiful website at jillshalvis.com. I think you're on Facebook and Instagram and
Yes.
Goodreads. You're very active. And so people should be following you and picking up this fantastic story, Better Than Friends. And again, Jill, we just love you coming back on the show. We hope to see you again in the future. All the best with this one.
Well, I have a June book, so let's talk then.
Let's do it.
Thanks for
Take
having
care
me.
now.
We
Thank
got a
you
lot
so
of
much.
answers, and I feel that she agreed with our, I guess, our interpretation of the characters and their journey.
I thought that was really cool when she was talking about you can't go home again, or can you? But I was thinking that, and I wanted to ask her about this too. When you do go home again, I think that's when you have to confront a lot of things that you perhaps thought were in your past, not just a first love. I mean, we even have a confrontation of that on the street, which I thought was a great scene, but
Right.
also just those emotional things that you maybe had tucked away for a bit. Well, when you go home again, you have to address them because sometimes they physically bump into you and sometimes they're just present because of the context.
Absolutely. And another thing too is the ages that they were at the point where this first incident and this first interaction occurred. Our characters were 17, 18, and
Yeah.
that's such a developmental, about to go out into the world and about to make something of yourself, and you have something kind of crush you and devastate you a little bit. So you leave and you spend your 20s like developing around that incident, I think. And
Mm.
they came back when they were 30, right? 29,
Yeah.
30. And I'm not even 30 yet. I don't know how the things that I went through in my early 20s are going to develop into, into that time frame. So I thought that was a very interesting timing for them.
I love that phrase you use. I almost feel like that needs to be like a psychology term
What
of
phrase?
developing around
I'm
these
sure it is.
traumas. Well, if that's not a technical term, it should be because I think that's a pretty good one.
But no, I mean, it felt accurate. And I also think that these characters have multitudes as well. So they started out, maybe they have personalities that were timid or stubborn, and they developed into a funnier person or a softer person or just somebody more equipped to handle revisiting.
Yeah,
So
Jill's very good at that.
absolutely. She turned a lot of deep things into it. She gave levity to it, you know? Is that is that the right word?
Yeah. No, that was a
Okay.
perfect description of her writing. Well, I'm going to tell our listeners about some other authors that we have coming up. We have a stellar lineup in addition to Jill Shalvis, of course. We've got Alex Hay with The Queen of Fives, John Shannon with Boys Town, Allison Raskin, Save the Date, Fiona Davis, The Stolen Queen, Carter Wilson, Tell Me What You Did, Mark Greaney, Midnight Black, Marshall Karp, Don't Tell Me How to Die, Tess Gerritsen, The Summer Guest, Robert Crace, The Big Empty, Brian Freeman writing for Robert Ludlum, The Bourne Vendetta. We have Robert Dugoni and Jeff Langholtz and Chris Crabtree, who are the three authors of Hold Strong. We have Alka Joshi with 6 Days in Bombay. And listeners, we just love that you are with us. We ask that you share our socials, you stay on the radar with us. We are on Facebook, on Instagram, on X, on TikTok, on YouTube, and we are just thrilled that you've been along for this ride. And as you know, stay on the radar with us because your favorite authors are here.